All right. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us here today at the Lenovo stage at the Gnomon School here in Hollywood for our event, the VFX of the Peripheral. My name is Bo Jansen. I'm the education lead for the VFX program here at Gnomon, and it's a great honor. I'm going to be hosting our guests here tonight. Before I introduce them, I want to say a couple things. First off, we are back streaming on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook today. So hello to all people joining us streaming. If you're looking for closed captions for this event, join us on Facebook. Facebook has the closed captions. Also, we're going to be archiving this event after it ends. In a couple days, check out our YouTube channel for archive of this event if you want a recap of what's going on. This event is sponsored today by Lenovo and AMD. So big thanks as always to Lenovo and AMD for helping us provide these free educational events to our community here on campus. And with that said, we're going to have our presentation here. At the end, we'll have a Q&A with people from the audience as well as people online. So if you want to add in questions on the stream, you're welcome to. We'll be fielding some of those after the event. And I'd like to now introduce our guests to this evening. We have Mark Spatny, VFX co-supervisor and producer for The Peripheral. All right, Mark is a graduate of University of Southern California as a set and lighting designer. Mark Spatny has worked for over 25 years in the visual effects industry, supervising and producing VFX for over 400 episodes of television and a dozen feature films. He has earned 5 Emmy nominations and won twice. He helped create Visual Effects Society Awards and is currently co-chair of the Los Angeles section of the Visual Effects Society and served 9 years as governor of the Special Visual Effects Peer Group for the Television Academy. His credits include The Peripheral, Station 19, Heroes, Doctor Who, Lethal Weapon, iRobot, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and Marvel's Runaways. And also like to introduce here, yes. Ooh. Also introduce here Jay Worth, also VFX co-supervisor and producer for The Peripheral. Jay is an Emmy Award-winning visual effects supervisor and producer and has spent 17 years working in visual effects. He has been the visual effects supervisor on Fringe, Person of Interest, Revolution, 11/22/63, Counterpart, The Magicians, Living with Yourself, Altered Carbon, Reminiscence, and Westworld, for which he won the Emmy for Best Visual Effects in 2017 and was nominated again in 2018 and 2020. His work has also earned him Emmy nominations for Lost, Fringe, Almost Human, Revolution, and 11/22/63, and a VFX Society Award for Fringe, and nominations for Alias, Revolution, Living with Yourself, and Westworld. He also worked on The Peripheral, released last year, and is currently working on an adaptation of the video game Fallout for Amazon Studios. So, with all that said, welcome our guests here for VFX of The Peripheral.
Hey, so thank you everyone who came tonight. And I also want to say thank you very much to Gnomon for also inviting not just us, but also the members of the Visual Effects Society who are attending here in person tonight and also streaming online. It's great that you were able to extend that invitation to our members. So without further ado, The Peripheral is a little difficult to describe the show. I think the best way to describe it is really a cyberpunk time travel story. In summary, it's a group of people who are hired to use a VR headset to commit a crime in the future, piloting essentially a robot body in the future, because it would be the perfect crime. You wouldn't be able to trace it back to the person who actually conducted the crime because of the time travel aspect. Only they are able to trace it back, and chaos ensues and problems develop, and that's our story. But to show you what it's about, let me just play a little trailer to introduce you to it.
Your skills are being sadly wasted in this den of imbecility.
I got things to do. Mama needs tending, the house needs cleaning. I'm done pretending that I can live in this sim. It ain't real. What is it?
Cutting edge VR, Flynn. Folks want me to beta test it for a shitload of money too. Just lay back, close your eyes. Count back from 10.
This is London. But London's 70 years from what you think of as the present.
It was like being there, in your body.
You're inside the peripheral. Piloting that body as if it were your own.
Holy shit. I thought I was playing a sim.
It turns out if you prick us, we bleed.
Oh, makes me miss the show. That was fun.
Yeah, that was fun.
Yeah,
Little flashback.
little flashback. So we started this show. I remember actually getting the script for this in 2018. It just kind of makes you realize how long it takes sometimes for these things to come to fruition. But because of COVID and a lot of other reasons, it was a challenging pre-production. We actually shot primarily in London, and we stayed here in LA without being able to travel there for all the quarantine and COVID reasons for when we were doing it. So it was very difficult in a lot of ways to deal with that, from time zones to Zoom calls to pre-production to all the things that make production already challenging mixed with all of that. But we were able to make it through and really kind of work well with the production team. We hired an on-set team to help out with all of the on-set needs through a company called Blue Bolt. And really had a lot of trust with our production team, specifically our production designer, our DP, and our directors. Vincenzo, who was our director, he was actually one of the people who had kind of brought the project, knowing William Gibson, the writer. So he had a lot more investment sometimes than a normal, television director who might just be coming in as a hired hand, which really helped with the back and forth in terms of a creative process. Made a lot of fun in terms of developing and kind of figuring out how to build out the world.
Just a few production stats. Like Jay said, the bulk of our show was filmed in London. That was our primary place. We had sets built there. We also did location shooting, and we did some in-camera virtual production, which we'll go over shortly. Later, we shot in North Carolina because that's where all of our sort of present-day storyline takes place. The story that's 70 years in the future is London. The more or less now, it's supposed to be, I think, 2030.
Yeah.
That took place in North Carolina, so we did have to get those locations to make it look good. And then we did some additional photography in New York as we were in post and decided to revise some scenes to fit the edit a little bit better. We had 10 on-set crew mixed between those 3 locations. I think we had 7 in London, and we did something a little different. Now, most of you have probably experienced having to LiDAR your sets. Because of COVID, we actually encountered a problem where production couldn't figure out how to get people onto our set from LiDAR vendors to come in because of the, having to quarantine for a certain number of days and test a certain number of days before going onto set. So we ended up buying a LiDAR scanner and training our crew to do it ourselves, which honestly is the way to go. From now on, I would pretty much do that if I needed it onto a show, because it just made it so much easier. And anytime somebody wasn't working on set, they could be LiDARing either a set or props or whatever and just be taking care of that, which was great. A little bit about our schedule. This is a sort of a representation of a normal episodic schedule. You'll prep an episode, you'll start shooting it, that episode goes into post, you start a next episode, and by the 3rd episode, you're in all stages of production. You're prepping one show, you're shooting 1 or 2 shows, you may be in post for 3 or 4 shows, and so you're constantly juggling that, which gets pretty crazy. Our show was different because of having to shoot in different locations. We did what's called block shooting. So the way it worked was we shot every location all the way through for every episode. We had all of our scripts before we started shooting, so production could sit there and figure out that, okay, we're going to build this set and we're going to shoot on it. We're going to do this scene from episode 1, this scene from episode 3, this scene from episode 8, and then move on. We had some limited stage space, so we jumped back and forth where we would shoot out our stages that were built, and then we'd go out on location. They would tear down one set of sets, build another set of sets, go back in, shoot on the sets, then go back into location, and we bounced back and forth a little bit like that. And then we did the same thing in North Carolina, although North Carolina was primarily just locations. I don't think we built sets. We had, from the time that I came on, serious prep where it started, like Jay said, it started years ahead of time, but the really like formal figuring it all out in detail, what we're going to do on each day. We had 2 months of prep for that. We did 6 months of shooting, and then we had 11 months of editing and post. Just a little bit about some of the production stuff. Most of it was very traditional visual effects. You know, it was handled the normal way, but we did jump into virtual production for this. And then you...
Yeah, so this was really kind of a mandate. One of the things that's really challenging, obviously, when you get into traditional visual effects is driving. It sounds so silly, but it's like, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to throw up a green screen? Are you going to go do it practically? Or are you going to do it on a volume? Jonah Nolan, who is the gentleman who I've been working with for a number of years from Person of Interest in Westworld, he's very much of a do-it-for-real kind of guy. We've had a lot of experience now doing various different things in virtual production, and the main thing always comes down to the lighting, right? It's one of those things that you can't really capture very well when you're trying to do it poor man's. And so we really wanted to figure out what was the best way to use the technology. And this driving sequence ended up being the best use of it. And primarily the reason is we have all these reflective surfaces, obviously. And one of the things we had was this thing called a Coid, which we'll get into a bit later. But one of the big challenges was we had a huge fight sequence that was just this massive fight sequence. And they're like, look, there's just not a way for us to take a Rolls Royce, a super fancy Rolls Royce, drive it through the streets of London with 2 people wrestling around inside a car and trying to figure out how to do it on a rig. They're like, this just isn't going to happen. So the second we realized that that was the case, we decided to do it on a volume. And we were able to figure out how to shoot and stitch the plates, and then be able to figure out how to do this entire thing on a volume stage. And one of actually the other tricky parts was doing a motorcycle. I was petrified, honestly. I'm like, okay, we'll do the car. That's great. Motorcycle. I'm like, guys, this is a horrible idea. But it ended up working out really well. We were very specific about the camera angles to choose, and we never got very wide on it. We stuck on the face. We actually, one of the things that we really wanted to make sure when we were doing, when you do anything on a stage like this, is we were very specific about only putting a camera where you would have really put a camera if you were shooting this for real as a driving sequence. And that's like the simplest way to make something look real when you're doing something on a process stage. Is the last thing you want is someone on a dolly right outside the car going back and forth. It's like, where's your camera? It's like literally there's no way to do that. So we really wanted to make sure if we did it this way, to put the camera only where you would really put a camera if you were doing this for real. And I think that's one of the reasons why the sequences actually worked very well, was we kept to that sort of traditional filmmaking, even when you're doing something high tech in the midst of it.
So one of the things that we did on this, we did some driving around London with a camera rig, a 9-camera rig. It was 8 mini Alexas and a red camera to get the sky reflections. And they spent, I think, 2 days just driving around different parts of London that were very specific routes that were planned. We did the plates for the driving, and then we did drive-bys where we actually had the people on the motorcycle and the cars driving through so we could get those exterior shots. There's a big advantage to shooting with one of these kind of rigs. You can do driving with just a single camera, and you can go back and forth and do the same street over and over again. But with one of these rigs, you can get exactly like matching, perfectly aligned plates that can be stitched together. And the stitching especially helps on the LED volume. If you get onto a stage, if you've ever shot on one, you can, in the software on the stage, sort of loosely overlay the different plates from the different camera angles and do sort of a soft wipe between them. But you'll definitely see those in camera if you're not really careful about where you place them, maybe behind like the pillar of a window or something. But instead, we stitched these plates together. It turned out to be sort of a monumental task. It didn't seem like it would be a big deal. But to play on the LED stage, they had to be 12,000 pixels across, these stitches. And so we started to approach companies. Oh, and we had a week to do it. Our schedule got a little jinked up for the LED stage. There was a scheduling conflict. They had to actually move us earlier. So we had a date shot that we were going to be shooting these plates. It was all set up. We had all the permits to drive around London. And then they moved our day on the stage earlier. So I had to call up, I don't know, must have been about 30 companies and just go like,
Please.
hey, I have these 12,000K stitches. Could you, hello? We found 2 companies that were willing to do it, and only like they told us how much time they could do. Like this is how much we could accommodate. So we went to our director, and I think ultimately we had 4 minutes of footage, something like that. And so we had our director pick the footage that we were going to use for very specific scenes and got those stitched. But this is just kind of what it looks like, just to give you an example of how the stitch footage looked. And then this is just sort of the results. I've got a little bit of the motorcycle that Jay was talking about and the car.
And we did a lot of little things in these where it was like, we actually did extensions on the visor to clean up on top. We ended up doing a little bit of touch-up work on some of the background plates, but really so much of it ended up being for more or less in camera. And cutting with the live footage, obviously, when you had the real footage that you were matching to the streets was the reason this whole sequence worked. The fact that we were able to plan that out. And the one thing about the world we created was it's the future London, right? But this thing called the jackpot happens and 80% of the population has died away. So it's not a futuristic show in terms of this, high-tech version of things. We actually took this idea of if 80% of the population died away, what would you do? You would actually move into the really nice houses and take the really nice cars and just put the technology into that rather than building new things. So we were able to create this world that has this feeling of old London mixed with this idea of this new higher technology, which actually helped us in visual effects. All we had to do was a lot of cleanup in some things, but we really shot London for London, which made it a lot of fun. We did this other thing where we made the roads reflective, which gives you this whole kind of futuristic vibe. But again, it gave us something that was a little easier to bite off. It wasn't just the normal world building where you're just putting a bunch of steel and glass up into the sky.
Yeah, that was really critical for us. We didn't want it to look like your normal, Blade Runner style future where there's giant buildings everywhere because the population's exploded. It wasn't our world. The glass streets was very cool because the idea is that they're solar panels. Do you want to talk about the chevrons?
Oh yeah, so the chevrons, we basically made up this thing where they're like, what about if there's a way that you have these glass streets, right? And they ended up being, we made up our own rules, right? Half the time I think with world building, you have to make up rules for your world. I've had to build a lot of different worlds. And if you have something to ground it in reality, it always helps us. So we ended up having the chevrons that were out in front of the cars be pedestrian safe. So basically, it was as far as the car would take to brake approximately. But it's weird how much that helped grounded in reality, where people would be like, I totally understand that these things are part of the car and part of the world. They don't necessarily know why they work, but they knew why, but they actually worked from a visual storytelling standpoint. But those were actually more difficult to design than I ever thought they would be. First, it was going to be a line, then it was going to be under the car. And after you watch it, you're like, of course that's what it is, but that's never how you get there, right?
And if you watch as cars speed up or slow down, the lines actually move ahead or get closer to the car to be that braking distance. It's a real subtle thing. Maybe a lot of people in the audience wouldn't notice it, but it was our world and it was rules, and we had to go through, and they blink at certain intervals. We had to always count.
You end up feeling it as an audience member, I think, more than knowing what it is, which is what's fun about it.
We had another sequence that we needed to shoot on this stage, primarily because it was a glass and chrome set. We had an elevator. We see that elevator in use in a couple of different scenes in a practical building, so we had to match that. But in this sequence, the elevator is going a couple hundred levels below ground. and it's passing some enormous laboratories that are going, research laboratories that are being used to regrow the earth. Basically, as Jay said, there's most of the population has died. There's been ecological collapse. There's been a lot of problems. So they're doing a lot of research to try and build up agriculture again, build up animal populations again. So we see some different labs going through there. Again, because of scheduling and our shoot date for the LED volume moving, we had 1 month to turn this giant laboratory elevator sequence, and you'll see it in a minute. You'll see what a challenge that was. And we, again, approached a bunch of different companies. A lot of people were like, ooh, one company, Rodeo, give them credit because they were amazing. They really jumped at this. They, without us asking, did a bunch of concept art. They threw it at us and said, look, this is what we could do in a month. We'll be reusing assets that we've created for other things. We'll be kit bashing. We'll put this all together. If you let us art direct it with stuff that we have and you don't start trying to create all kinds of new things, we can turn this around in a month. And we said, yes, please. So let me just show you. This is this environment. Again, it's a 12,000 pixel wide image. So imagine rendering that. Every pass on this render, took an enormous amount of time to turn around when we were giving notes. It actually ended up getting finished at 7 a.m. the morning of the shoot. So we had to send it there. Now, notice that the LED, the image on the LED wall looks pretty different from how the animation looked when we were just playing the raw animation. I wanted to show this to you because it is kind of critical if you're doing an LED wall shoot to have the person who was most familiar with that imagery on set, because this one element was played too bright on the screen. And because Jay and I couldn't be there, we didn't recognize that. And our DP didn't realize that it was playing too bright. So we ended up, there were 7 shots that we had to sort of replace the backgrounds because they were too bright and became grainy. So just keep in mind that if you're doing something like this, somebody who's extremely knowledgeable about what those elements should look like needs to be on set to just sort of flag like, oh, that should be brighter, darker.
Or just to get a good test day.
Yeah.
But because it came in so hot, a little rough.
Literally, it was 7 a.m. the morning of the shoot.
Yeah.
This stuff got sent across. So let me show you what this ended up looking like. Here's our practical elevator. And now we're in the virtual set. This is the reflections off the LED screen playing on a glass window that's part of the set. That's over the shoulder into the LED wall.
What is this place?
Infinity in the palm of your hand. Eternity in an hour.
And again, it's great because we've got the real lighting that you would be getting in that environment through the glass windows on the actors. They feel like they're the right color temperature. It's all really working. You don't have to fake that with lighting. It's the element itself lighting the actors.
And that was the other one that was a challenge about that one. It was like, when you don't have time to previs something, they're like, how many floors can you do? They're like, we want to do 5 floors. I'm like, I don't think you have time to do 5 floors. And we're just trying to figure it all out. And we ended up thankfully timing it out, and we did our own little type of previs, but it ended up working out really well. But it was just
they had imagined this being a much even bigger, more labs to go through. And we're like, there's not enough dialogue to cover that. How much
there's
time
literally they literally say, where is this? I mean, there was like 2 lines of dialogue. I'm like, guys, 3 floors. Let's get out of here. It was fun.
Okay, so after we shot, we got into post-production. Just a couple of things. We had about 2,500 shots. Not all of them ended up in the show. We finished some that in the editing process, you start out with an episode that's 60 minutes long. It needs to go to 44 minutes, so things get cut along the way. But I think we ended up around 2,400 shots. We had 16 visual effects companies around the world, some here in LA, Portland, London, Vietnam, India, Louisiana, New York. I can't remember where else.
Toronto?
Montreal.
Montreal.
Montreal. Yeah. So it was everywhere. Some of that was dictated, as you would imagine, from the business by tax incentives. Some of it was just we went and found companies that were willing to do the work. As many of you may be aware, during that period last year and the year before, there was this glut of visual effects work, and all of the visual effects facilities in town were just too full. Literally, Netflix did a study and found that there was not enough visual effects capacity to even do all of their shows, let alone all the Marvel shows and Star Wars and all of that stuff. So most companies were very full up. We had companies that would tell us, oh, we're not even going to look at your material unless you've got like $4 million to commit to us. But so we did go to some companies and we did make those commitments, but other stuff, we went to smaller shops, we went to different people, we went to companies that Jay was familiar with and I was familiar with. And along the way, there were a lot of edit changes, which we'll go into a little bit more later. And then just a lot of what we had imagined was going to, how the world was going to look like, ended up changing as it evolved, as our executive producers got to look at it more in post and think about things. Some pretty dramatic changes happened. So we'll dive into that.
Probably the most iconic part of our series are these things called air scrubbers. And they're these, 10,000 foot basically monoliths throughout the city. When we were getting into the design phase of this, we started just playing with a lot of different ideas. They were going to be this organic thing. They were going to have all these different ribbons. Then they were going to have water elements. And then they were going to have things growing off of them. But they never really could settle on something that they liked and that was iconic enough for the show. We really struggled with what this thing was, what its purpose was, and what it really wanted to look like when you were just flying over London and understanding possibly even what this thing was. And so, interestingly enough, we went back and we found an old deck from when we were doing pre-production on something. And there was one image of the David statue with all these different parts around it. And basically our showrunner, one of our showrunner executive producers, like, that's what I want it to look like. So after we got that, that idea, then we really had to figure out, well, what does this mean, right? And so we couldn't just put Davids all over the world. So we wanted to pick one building that the David was, and then we went with this neoclassical idea, and it kind of fits with this idea of what London is, which is kind of this embrace of the old traditional. And one real quick thing about the David, and this is where I love working with the team that I love working with, they're not very practical. They're very much dreamers, and just like they get an idea and they're like, we'll get it done. So, we're like looking at the David and all of a sudden, well, let's figure out what it's going to take to clear it and all these different things. And I can't tell you how many roadblocks we hit to clear this statue. It was like, turns out Italy owns it and all these different people own it and you're not allowed to show it. And if you do show it, you can't show it in a promotional, like it was crazy how much it was. And most, I think, executive producers at one point would have just been like, you know what, this is too much. But our executive producers are like, no, this is what we want. Figure it out. And it ends up being one of those things that ends up being the icon of the entire show and the entire series because they pushed us to do it, which I think sometimes, for me personally, sometimes I'm a little too practical. Sometimes I'm like, we can make something that looks cool. And he's like, no, but it doesn't look like the David. And it really ends up being cool. So once we designed the David, then we had all these other statues that we wanted to do to fill the rest of the world. So we ended up going through and picking a bunch of different iconic statues that kind of felt like the same idea. And these ones, actually, we did go through and figure out which ones were easier to clear. Yeah. We're like, how about this one's iconic, but it's not really hard to clear? And thankfully, they were good with that. It's like the Athena, we're good with that one. And, these different iconic statues, which was really fun to design these. And once again, we kind of made up these different rules of the way that the greebles worked is as they cleared the air more of the statue was revealed. So on the outer ones, there are these huge statues, and those are more just statues surrounding it. And as you got closer to the inside of the city, they had more of this structure on it, and it's kind of also thinking ahead to, a season 2, a season 3, getting these more ideas out there. And once you build this world, the writers can then take and pick off those things and keep going with it. So that was a fun one.
And it was always a balance of doing the classical statue, but also remembering that this was supposed to be a giant, enormous air filter.
Yeah, exactly.
That they are sucking in radiation and pollutants and all of this stuff that had been created by 70 years of nuclear war and ecological collapse and other things, and just cleaning the air and getting it back to it. So it needed to look partly industrial, partly classical statues, and that's how we came with this. Let's take a look at how some of those turned out.
So these were ones we basically got to have a lot of fun placing them all through the city, and we figured out the math problem of how big they were supposed to be. So it wasn't always like the Eiffel Tower in every shot, but it still was an air scrubber in every shot. But we actually figured out where it was in the world, and we made a map and actually stuck to it pretty effectively, which ended up helping create this groundedness that you didn't always see the same one. And when you were looking in certain directions, you really had a sense and a feel for the reality of the world.
Another one of our big challenges were what was called Coids. These are basically servant robots in the future. Again, population decimated, you need help doing everyday manual labor. So robots are everywhere. They're called Coids. Our original design idea was literally to just do masks on our actors. They cast prosthetic masks. Our production designer signed off on it. Our director signed off on it. Showrunner signed off on it. We filmed it that way. The idea was originally going to be that we would just fill in the eyes, so it would look like sort of a generic sexless face. But as you can see, once it was on camera, what sounded like a great idea just wasn't impressive enough. It wasn't futuristic enough. It looked like what it was. It was a guy in a mask, and so then we were given the challenge of, let's get rid of that.
And it was trying to figure out, what do you do with that? So then I'm like, okay, well, if it looks like a person in a mask, what if we shrunk the neck? That's actually something easy we could do in visual effects. And if you shrink the neck, at least it gives it a sense of that it's not a person in a mask, and it gives that little sense of something. And so we thought we were going to be going with that. And then Jonah comes and drops the bomb on us. At some point, he's like, guys, I hate to say this, we have to redo the Coid. I'm like, so just the one Coid? He's like, every Coid. I'm like, how many end up? 500 shots?
Yeah.
I'm like, wow, that's a lot of Coid fixing. Okay, but let's figure out what you want to do with the idea first. So all he came to us was, he's like, I have an idea of a hollowed out head and a face made of triangles. And I'm like, what does that even mean? So we started the design process once again of trying to figure out how this is going to work, right? How we're going to basically keep all the beauty of this kind of, this white iridescent idea mixed with this new technology of having something that feels like it's coming off of, he had this idea of coming off like a bonsai tree with triangles coming off of monofilament, and having lights inside so you feel the depth. And that the whole idea of the Coid head eventually ended up being that it was kind of like an iPhone. Everyone's iPhone's the same, but you can put different screens on it, right? So you can personalize it if you need to. And it can still be very generic, but it can also be personalized as you get into it. So as we were able to do that, we really realized that it was going to help the story in a lot of ways. We were going to be able to make them personal when need be, and make them generic when need be to serve the story.
Oh, sorry, let me go back.
So this is what the Coid ended up looking like. And you saw what it was going to be before. And it really ended up adding this really cool, simple bit of futurism. And then we were able to add these butterflies that matched to her outfit for this, really create the depth there. And there were just so many things about it that ended up being really a lot better for the entire series. These were a constable Coid that was a police-like character throughout the show. But then we got to a whole series and realized that at this point, Charisse turns one of her people. she basically, once someone dies, she wants to upload his personality. And it was always in the script that it was going to be the Daniel Coid, but his face was never supposed to be on it. So they just shot it as a guy in a mask, and it was just going to be his voice. And all of a sudden then we realized that we had to put his face onto this Coid head. Of course, once again, we realized this. The actor's only available for one weekend. We realize on the Thursday night, we have to book a stage in London, do a performance capture, figure out how the technology is going to work, try and get the performance captured by Saturday to be able to turn all this material around, which, my goodness, that wasn't fun. So then it's Saturday morning. Somehow we throw together a shoot on a stage in London, get the actor there, and it's like, 6 in the morning, and it's me and the executive producer trying to direct him from afar as to doing his performance. But the challenge was, the only stage we could get was a full body volumetric capture, and all we needed was his head. So the fidelity on his head was good, but it wasn't good enough for the close-ups that we ended up needing. So then we're stuck with this uncanny valley of this Daniel Coid of, let the next one, all of a sudden we got a Daniel Coid that, the one on the left, I mean, it kind of looks interesting, but it kind of looks creepy, let's be honest. It doesn't look, also, you think about the technology, and that's one of the challenges you have when you're doing a world-building futuristic show. You can only let it go so far when it's not going to work. The technology has been able to make these human peripherals that basically look and feel like a human that are operated by someone's consciousness. You have this whole other technology, and you're telling me you can't create a face that looks good? All of a sudden, the technology falls apart, and your world building kind of falls apart. So we took this to our vendor, and thankfully, one of the cool things about this one was we took it to our vendor, and they're like, okay, we are not deepfake people at all, but I've been playing around with it, so just get me a few images of this actor and we're going to put it in the algorithm and see what happens. And sure enough, the one on the left was our input, and the one on the right was literally the simplest little bit. Daniel wasn't even in the show very much. It was like, what, 5 minutes of material, maybe? And we were able to get that much fidelity out of it by putting it in an off-the-shelf deepfake just to get that looking better.
And keep in mind, this is not video playing on those little triangles. It's a 3D animation with texture maps on it, and that's what we had to do.
Exactly.
We used the footage of the actor talking in scenes where he was actually live to create those deep fakes to get the fidelity into the textures for the 3D model.
Well, and the thing is we still used his performance, because the beautiful thing was we captured all of his lines. He did his entire performance, but we didn't know which angle it was going to be at. So we had the 3D model of him doing all these performances and all the dialogue. That's the other thing that was really important, is to be able to capture all the audio live on the day. It basically became a glorified ADR session, which was exactly what we needed. And then we were able to just put that little bit of secret sauce on it to make it look real.
And the reason why it had to be a 3D model is because before we knew we were going to be putting the actor's face on it, it was just a guy in the white mask again. And the guy was performing, he was turning his head every which way, and there was no way to just shoot video of the actor on a green screen and match that performance. So it had to be 3D. And another challenge we didn't mention is, since we weren't planning on replacing any of these masks, we put no tracking markers on them. There was no intention to replace the heads. So all of that had to be manually matched, moved. Thanks to our friends in Bot and Refuge who did that for us. There's an enormous amount of just, hand tracking work to go in there. But let me play.
Yeah. One of the reasons why it was really good, we had 11 months.
Yeah.
But when you watch the sequence, it's kind of hard to imagine it without the face on there at the end of the day. When we had watched this before with him just doing the ADR, it all kind of ended up falling flat when we were really looking at it. And then this is a sequence that they actually redid to have, we didn't reshoot it. We repurposed this. Used to be a scene that he was in, and we ended up using his actual performance here to put it onto the mask, which ended up working as well. And that was one of the other challenges, is we had this footage which we had actually shot, so we had to make the other footage look good enough to match the real footage, which I think was that other hurdle we had to jump over.
So another sequence that we had was what we called the boat battle. It was actually the opening of the show, and it was kind of a misdirect. When you watch the show start, you're in the middle of a battle between two ships. It's a recreation of the Battle of Trafalgar, and the note in the script and what our director and our executive producer wanted was it was supposed to look like you're in a Master and Commander kind of movie, and we're in the middle of that, traveling through it, and then the smoke clears, and then you realize that, oh no, it's actually model ships on a pond, and there's one of our actors is watching it. But they really wanted to go with the whole time travel aspect of faking the audience into thinking, oh, this is a time travel show. I guess this is the time period we're in. So that was very complicated to do. We knew that it was going to be difficult to shoot on the day. Cameras were going to have to be on a lake and move forward. And so timing of it was going to be an issue. So for our first shot, we did a previs just to get a sense of how this would work.
And trying to help the DP figure out lens,
Right.
how long the camera move should be, how far you could be out on the water, what all those different aspects of it were, which, ended up being a guide that we, pretty much weren't able to stick to very much, but it did helping a lot, just to at least figure out what we were going to do with it.
This was initially a huge sequence. We had many, many shots of it, including ships sinking and on fire and all of that. And that was one of our sequences that ended up getting trimmed for time. So it was actually a really gorgeous sequence overall, watching all of these things. But this is how it turned out in the show. You can see our guy back there. It was really great actually working with Zoic on this sequence, because we did post-viz on this where they rebuilt this scene in Unreal and they were able to move things around. We could see it in real time, and Jay could adjust where the boats were going to be, how much smoke there was, where the fire was. We could play with that all in Unreal, get it, sign off on it, and then they went to Maya to render it for real with all the detail.
But it was much faster by doing it in Unreal.
Yeah. Another one of our big effects for the show, again, hundreds of shots, was one of our characters, Connor. In the show, we learned that he's been injured in a war that happens in our future, near future. He unfortunately encounters a booby-trapped dog. It blows up, takes off his 2 legs and 1 arm. And so all through the show, we see him as an amputee, a triple amputee, on this special vehicle that's basically like a Segway. He can move around on it by adjusting his weight and moving it. But it was very tricky to do because we had to, obviously, we did not have a triple amputee actor, so we had to remove his limbs all the way. This is just a concept piece for it. This isn't actually from the show, but this was just sort of a test piece. We built prosthetic legs for him. The makeup department was able to build those for us. We actually used them for certain scenes. Like there's a scene where he's sitting on a couch in a trailer. We actually built the couch so it had a hole in it and he could stand in it, and the real prosthetic legs were there looking like his legs, and he's able to hide his arm and have the prosthetic arm. But most of the shots, it had to be replaced with 3D. So we did scans of these so we could get very detailed and match them exactly. And then we had to look at how the vehicle was designed. And the special effects crew built this, whereas actually the monowheel, the one thing that he rides like a Segway, that would be puppeteered. And they had to actually have training sessions with him where he actually would lean back and forth, and the puppeteer guys moving it would do it to match, so it felt like it was real, so that like as he shifted his weight, it would tip and all of that. They worked all of that out. And then his monowheel connects to another piece that ends up becoming like a tricycle motorcycle that he rides around in. And so that had to be all engineered so it could come together realistically, because we had shots where he actually enters into it and connects those 2 pieces and then drives away. And it was very tricky. We had to figure out camera angles to shoot him at that would make it easy to remove the limbs but not have to replace all of the machinery underneath, because we really were trying to avoid having to have that whole contraption underneath him be CG. So the way we ended up doing that was every shot of him we shot as 3 passes. We shot him with the puppeteers, and then we put the stumps on the vehicle and just moved those through the scene, mostly as a lighting reference.
Yep.
And then we just did the vehicle as a clean plate. So we always had those elements for the compositors to work with, so they could pick and use whatever parts were necessary.
And the other part about this for our show, Greg Plegeman, one of our showrunners, he actually has a lot of connections with the military community, and Jonah does as well. And so we had our military advisor as well as a amputee who was in the military as a consultant on the show, which really helped to, create all this realism of ways he could move. We had full training sessions of how you could actually move. Well, how would you get around the house? And we were able to stay true to a lot of those actual movements, which helped ground the performance and ground what we were trying to do as well. But yeah, we used every possible Forrest Gump, every trick in the book you could imagine we did back on this show, with every possible little thing to make this all feel real.
So here's some examples of that. Did a little before and after action here. You'll get a chance to see how actually big this rig was that we had to remove.
And the challenge really was to get his movement and his weight right, because the second the weight feels wrong, all of a sudden it's not going to work. Same thing with him on the ground. It was really hard to get him only to move with one arm and to scoot correctly. But it ended up, because of that, those consultants and all those training sessions, it really, I don't think you ever once didn't feel like it wasn't all grounded in reality, which was really a hallmark for his character, and how he could move all around.
But later in the show.
So then, so Connor, he's in the past, right? He's in 2030, and he visits the future. So the future, while we know it's a time travel show, it's not really a time travel show, because our characters aren't traveling there. It was this thing called quantum tunneling, which is interesting. It's basically their consciousness was piloting this body. And so Connor gets to pilot this body in the future. Then he's like, wait, this is the best thing I've ever experienced in my life. All of a sudden, I'm free to run, I'm free to roam, and I'm free to live my life. So he's like, I got to get myself one of those bodies. So he asks them if they're going to print one. So then you get into the, having now worked on Westworld as well as a couple other robot shows, it's always like, okay, well, how are we building the robot? And like we were saying, one of the other challenges is we have 2 different kinds of robots. We have peripherals, which are these things that are this bio-connected, mechanical thing that's supposed to look like a human, and you got the Coids, and you have to make sure they're different. So we wanted to build this one like it's a mostly organic, but have enough humanness in it, enough machine in it where you understand that it's this mechanical thing that could be piloted. So we came up with this whole sequence of how we were going to build it, and it was this table, and it was supposed to have these slices come up, but then we were afraid it was going to look too much like the Fifth Element, and we had all these different ideas going into it to try and how can we do something we haven't seen before. And we partnered with this company, Bellow Effects, and it was really cool because we were able to kind of keep with this original idea of these slices, but really kind of create something that felt new and interesting. We added this water texture to it to get this sense of bubbles and something else to shoot through that was interesting, and it tied back to something else and visually that they were in this mineral bath. And it kind of all went together as a story, but we were just stuck with, well, what's it supposed to look like and how is it supposed to print? And it was really fun to kind of figure out all those different aspects of things and how they all went together.
The other interesting thing about this was just from a logistical standpoint, the Connor's in 2030, they're making his body in 2100. They can't measure him. So how do they design and build this body? So they have gone through historical records and found all of his social media posts. So the idea is that they build him from photographs that they find online from internet archives and basically build a model out of photogrammetry from him, which became very cool. But the logistical problem was reminding production to take photos. We kept saying every time this actor is on set, you should take him aside in every environment that he's in, have him do a few costume changes, just have a photographer.
And before he's in his makeup, when he's got his no limbs, he's supposed to be anyway.
Yeah. So we would keep reminding them, and then they didn't do that. And then finally, when we were in our New York reshoots, we said we can't do the scene unless you give us those photos. So they took them around and they staged a bunch of shots, which was great. It worked out perfectly. But that's just something that as the visual effects team, you have to be aware of, because you know in your head how these storyboards need to work. You've got a lot of pictures you're going to need. You need to remind production to shoot them, because otherwise you're going to be in post and go like, oh, well, where's all the stuff we need? It is your responsibility as the visual effects team to make sure that production gets you everything that you need for that. Should we play?
Yeah. By the way, a sphere, if anybody ever says they're going to make a computer out of a sphere, just please tell them no. It's not fun to try and design graphics for a sphere.
Always a bit creepy, isn't it? When the AI takes hold.
The Sistine Chapel moment.
Which is meant to mean something, I'm sure.
God reaching toward Adam, transmitting the spark of life.
Oh yeah, our tattoos.
Yeah. Talk about that.
Yeah. That was another just little futuristic thing. We wanted these appearing and disappearing tattoos. It was a fun one that we got to add throughout the series.
Yeah, it was just a little tricky to know that obviously it was going to be hard to match move her limbs, and we had to do a scan of her to give the model to the company that was doing those effects, and they were extraordinarily expensive, so we had to pick and choose our moments, and it actually had to be designed so that you saw them coming on and disappearing, so that it didn't feel weird that you might see it one or two times in a scene and then not the rest of the scene, that they weren't just like popping on and off.
Yeah. It was fun one to try and figure out, though, from a story perspective and when she would do it. And it ended up working out really well.
Another fun challenge was back in 2030, we have a character, actually a couple of times in different scenes. We have characters who are in essentially VR worlds or video games, and we needed to see those represented. And we wanted it to look like they were in a video game, but we did not have the time or resources or anything to be able to actually do those as games. We couldn't motion capture the actors and build 3D assets and really have it built in a game engine.
And it was supposed to be 2030, so it still had to be something that was going to look more realistic. Where games are going to be in 7 years is going to be ridiculous.
Yeah, so the decision was to shoot it as regular footage and treat it. We ended up trying a bunch of different times with different colorists and different compositors, different looks, just applying filters, trying to smooth out skin, trying to do different things in color, and it just didn't work.
And just going with, what if it's just the footage?
Yeah.
What if it's just the footage and the video games are so good that it looks like real footage? And then, of course, they looked at that and they're like, that's not going to work. Figure something out.
So we had one artist who was like, let me play for this for a little while. I've got some deep fake ideas. So
he didn't even tell us that. He just basically said, give me some references of what you want it to look like. We sent him a bunch of stuff. We're like, it should look like this, but he didn't tell us what he was going to do.
We gave him a bunch of game footage.
But we didn't know what he was going to do with it, and he came back with this.
Yeah, so he took game footage, and he basically trained an AI. Instead of training it with like an actor's face to do a deep fake to make it look like an actor, he trained it with game footage. Once he knew the kind of footage that we were interested in doing, he found other footage like that, trained the AI, and then applied it to our footage. So then it made it look more game-like in more ways than we could have imagined. There's the skin tones changed to look more game-like. They can be a little flatter, less texture, but things that we could have never done in color, like detail of the hair, making it look like 3D instead of it looking like, real hair. Even the motion, like actually the AI interpreted the motion of the actors and made the motion feel more like game motion, and the camera moves feel more like camera moves. So
it was amazing. It was like one of those best uses, artists just coming up with something. He's like, I don't know, I came up with this over the weekend. We're like, you're the best artist. I will hire you for anything.
Important to note, though, that it was not an automated process.
No.
This was not something that you plug and played. Once he figured out how to do it, he had to render it for the whole scenes, and it became, hand tweaked. That it's something that gets applied over the footage, and you've got to balance, and sometimes it doesn't work, and you've got a roto to paint out artifacts and all of that. So it was still artist time intensive, but the look is amazing. So let me just play this one scene.
No esposa esta noche, señor.
Flying free this evening, Manuel.
Perhaps you'd like.
It ultimately ends up looking like you're just playing an Unreal
You old devil.
engine game, and that these are Unreal
What do you
metahumans.
take me for?
Un hombre de gran pasión.
Especially his
no?
beard. Our favorite thing is I think all the beards in this.
Well, put it like that.
And the skin
Guess I
folds.
couldn't
Oh,
spare
yeah.
some company. Ah. And what is your name, honey?
That was a real smoke ring, by the way, just in case.
Carmen.
You have any talents I should be aware of?
Would you excuse us, señorita?
If you look closely at his movement, just the way he moves his hands ends up being a little jerky, like it's motion capture, that it wasn't really that way.
And that was once again one of those kind of things that just came
quite
out
a
of it
difficult man to
that we didn't
contact,
ever
Mr.
give
Pickett.
necessarily notes on that.
Yeah.
That was just one of those things that ended up working out
Our
really well.
records indicate that you are an individual with
And we got lucky
some
that they both have
power
beautiful
and
beards that
influence
really
and
worked
talent
well with the technology.
circa 2030.
But this was one of those
And it
cases
also
where we,
seems that
after doing a bunch
you're
of
a man who
tests,
doesn't
we
indulge
showed
into
this to our executive producers, and they
Is
were
that
like,
correct?
done.
Yeah,
It's,
exactly.
You're 100% approved. Don't do anything more to it.
Exactly. Don't even
We
mess
have
with
a
this one.
situation.
Yeah.
Okay, so another big challenge are assemblers.
The assemblers. So one of the parts about this world was that it was rebuilt by nanotechnology. However, it kind of ends up being one of those things that you don't just want it to be this, I don't know, this idea of swarming bugs that come in and just kind of build something out of nothing.
It's been done a million times.
Yeah, and so we had the idea, and this is from the book, but the idea is that it breaks down objects to then reconstitute them and rebuild them. So we were able to then have two different ideas for it. One was the sequence which we're going to see, which was always the case, which was taking this idea of building down these buildings and having a whole building come up, which is where that was. But then when they liked it so much, they're like, what if it can happen with the Coids? And what if it can happen here? And all these different ideas. One of the other things that we ended up coming up with for this assemblers is I always try to find something where it's based in reality. So I'm always working with the artists going, let's just find some basis for this to be on something to hang our hat on so we can go, it's based on this, it's based on that. It has some aspect of reality. So we were partnering with the team at Zoic, and they're like, what about Verneuil patterns? So there's this whole thing and this lattice work of 3D printing and Verneuil patterns that we're able to kind of take that as our baseline and then start building upon it and take all of that basics of where 3D technology is going and kind of just futurize this thing of, okay, well, what if, something was able to break something down and rebuild it from a molecular level and see what it was going to look like for that standpoint. So we have a couple scenes here where it's breaking down technology and then building things in its place. And one of the challenges for this one also is to build a building this fast without it just feeling like a big wipe, which is never a fun challenge to have. But accelerating all these different aspects of things was a really fun aspect of things. And really keeping as much, there was no building there, but doing a lot of things at the end. We built this thing like 4 or 5 times. And even after producers approved it, Mark and I kept looking at it going, not
quite detailed enough.
Not there enough. So we added all these other aspects of things, these vents, we redid the whole structure on it a number of times. This one, when she's trying to torture him, this is the real Daniel, and showing him how the assemblers and having this whole idea of sand and particles breaking things down ended up kind of creating this beautiful, mysterious look as to not knowing what's going on.
You can't hear the dialogue, but she's basically explaining to him how easy it would be to make him disappear.
And of course, then she walks out onto it and something's holding her up. But the assemblers, and then and then that was the other challenge is the assemblers needed to then build our Coids at the beginning. Which once again, this scene was a challenge because this room wasn't built for this. The scene wasn't long enough, and so then we had to figure out, okay, what if some of the square patterns ended up becoming the Coids?
And this was a case again where we said, first of all, after the fact, if we have this technology, they'd be using it a lot more in this world. So we need to find times to make that make sense in the story, even though it wasn't scripted. But also, this was again one of those things where we had these robots just walk out, and it just wasn't futuristic enough. It just didn't have the production value we wanted to see guys in masks just walk into the room. So Jay thought of the idea, well, like this is a perfect place for us to introduce our assemblers. So this is how it was originally cut. This is what you were going to see in the original show.
So exciting.
Ooh, yes, very excellent. And then this is how it turned out. You can see the material being pulled off the floor to then form the actual.
And then this was the beautiful, crazy, weird triangle patterns coming up to make our Coids at the end. And then this was another sequence. And once again, you know, when an artist comes to you, these lock-offs were supposed to be the shot. And that first shot where we're pulling across the ground, you know, he just came to us one day. He's like, you know, you cut to that same shot twice. It's kind of boring. What if we made a full CG shot off the ground? I'm like, yes, please. Go do your magic. But ended up really becoming a special sequence out of it.
And then one of our bigger sequences, it was really probably the biggest thing in the show.
Yeah.
When we originally sent this sequence out to bid, it was basically over 1/10 of our budget for the entire show just for one scene. What happens is our character from 2030 piloting a Peripheral gets taken to what's called the Jackpot Museum. It's an artistic representation of what happened in the 70 years between. It's showing through artwork that there were massive blackouts, the power grid collapsed, there was ecological collapse, there's nuclear war, there was pestilence, there was plague, and she's shown all of this in an overwhelming place. It's actually, I think it's an illegal art installation in a graveyard that somebody's created. Graveyard obviously symbolizing the 7 billion people who have died. But you have to have the secret code to see it. So they take her to it because she wants to know, where's all the people? If this is the future, why are all the streets empty? Why don't I see anybody? So they're like, okay, well, we have something to show you. So we had this sequence, and luckily our director was a storyboard artist also.
It helps. Yeah, so he was able to create this kind of all these storyboards, which were really, when we got them, they were really elaborate. And we were, you know, kind of trying to figure out, well, how are we going to pull this off? Like Mark was saying, we got these bids, and we're sitting there trying to figure out how this is going to work. And this is where it's kind of this fun little happenstance. So back in 2019, I don't know if you guys ever saw, there was someone who put out a Westworld combination Game of Thrones trailer. And it was like a Westworld idea, but with Game of Thrones dragons. Anyway, it was a really cool trailer. And I saw it. It was a really cool idea. I'm like, no, this is amazing. I showed it to everyone on the crew. Jonah loved it. Everybody loved it. I reached out. I'm like, who did this? I mean, it was just some guy. And I reached out to the guy who did it. And this guy named Giles, he's in Belgium. And I'm like, oh, cool trailer. It was awesome. He's like, wow, this is amazing. I'm like, send me your information. Who knows? So this is like, whatever, 2.5, 3 years ago, 4 years ago now. Well, I saw this sequence and I'm like, you know what would be really good for this sequence? This guy saw his internet trailer named Giles. So we called him up. I'm like, what you been doing? He's like, I've been working. I'm just doing kind of trailer things and different visual effects things here and there. I'm like,
mostly motion graphics.
I'm like, how about handling the most challenging sequence we're going to do in the entire season? What do you think? And really, him and a few other people ended up doing the entire sequence over the course of 6 to 9 months.
Yeah, he was actually the first person we turned shots over to very early because we needed to previs. The original concept was actually that basically it was going to be like the holodeck, our character would find herself in these fully immersive worlds, that things were going to happen. She was going to be blasted by nuclear, blasts, and she was going to be experiencing the plague from like a hospital point of view, and all of these things that they just didn't have time to shoot. So between him and our director, they worked out the idea of it being more of an AR sort of experience.
Exactly.
And
really, once we realized what we could do with an artist like this, we were able to steer the director and the EPs into this direction, going, no, we're going to be able to pull this off. It's going to look amazing, and it's going to really serve the story well.
So the tricky part, of course, was if this was going to be an AR exhibit, we would have to film the environment in this graveyard with the actors and know how to frame the camera, because if you didn't get the camera framing right to show these different art pieces floating in the air, it wouldn't work. So Giles actually did a previs for us, and our on-set crew then went out to the graveyard and did like matching plates to the previs to show like where they would have to in the graveyard film things.
Yeah.
So this is just a short section.
Really faithfully mixed with really the ideas that they were coming up with.
In one corner, you've got the boards that the director had done, and then it's Giles's previs, and then our set crew showing how they would have to film plates to match it.
The iPhone previs. Very effective, by the way. But it really gave us the map that we needed to be able to shoot it accurately and what we were going to be able to do.
So this is how the sequence turned out.
This is the moment commonly pinpointed as the edge of the cliff, after which there is no turning back. The Jackpot was unstoppable. The hack of the North American electrical grid. Complete blackout. Months long, continent wide. An increasingly common phenomenon, as it turned out, across the globe.
That's just 7 years off in what world?
Pandemic. A filovirus. We called it the blood plague. It attacked the viscera, the liver, spleen, intestines, filling with blood till the abdomen burst.
Environmental catastrophe, droughts, famine, antibiotic failure.
Agricultural collapse followed.
Full population collapse.
About more than 7 billion people, over 4 decades or so. And then came the end. A domestic terrorist attack in the United States. They blew up a nuclear missile silo. Spring Creek, North Carolina.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah. So it ended up being a really kind of complicated, impactful scene that really kind of ended up being this really important moment for our character, and was really a fun challenge to be able to pull off throughout the season.
I want to also throw out there, this is where trust plays a big important part in something like this. When Jay came to me and said, I got this idea. I got this guy, and he did his own little trailer, and he posted it to YouTube, and it looks really cool. And I want to hire him to do by himself this sequence.
The most important sequence in the season.
Companies were going to put hundreds of artists on and charge us $2 million to do. My first instinct was obviously, as any visual effects producer would have said, like, you're out of your mind. We're not doing that. I'm putting my foot down. But I've known Jay for many years. We did a Comic-Con panel like 2008 together. I followed his career. I knew he did Westworld. So I'm like, okay, anybody else I would have said, no freaking way. But let's give it a try. And along the way, I'm every once in a while like, we still feeling good about this? Yes, everything's working out okay. This is really good.
It got a little dicey at the end.
I did at some point have to put my foot down and tell him, like, hire more people.
Yes, go hire a compositor.
I literally said, I'm going to throw you an extra $30,000 with which you are going to hire more people,
Yes.
whether you want to or not, to help you hit our deadline. Like we were just like, hey, we've got extra money, just use it. Take advantage of it. So it took a little finessing, but it turned out great. Also, I should mention, this is the same artist who, in his spare time, just in between this, also came up with the deep fake look for the VR treatment, where he was just like, hey, I got,
Literally, it was the same thing. I was sitting there, I'm like, we got to send it to Giles. Mark's like, you're sending it to Giles? Why? I'm like, I don't know. He just comes up with stuff. Let's just see what's going to happen. And that's another one for any independent artist out there. If you post something, make sure there's a way for people to contact you. Because I do this stuff all the time. I can't tell you how many times I find something on the internet that I love, and I try and find the person who did it, and I can't find them. I mean, I remember this other one back in the day. I tried to find this guy from Spain that did the fifth thirds, whatever. Like, it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen like 12 years ago. Couldn't find him anywhere. He was the other one that I was thinking back in the day. But that's the thing is, as an artist, make sure there's a way for people to contact you, because we love that stuff. Well, at least I do.
Yeah, a lot of what ended up getting people work on this show was them showing passion. Again, that elevator sequence, we had people who were like, they would give us a bid number and, they'll take it, whatever, they'll try and get it done. Then we had a company who was like, hey, in our spare time, we had one of the top map painters in the world. He had a couple days free. We had him do some sketches for you. I'm like, you got Rocco to do these sketches for us?
Yeah.
Like, what the hell? Yes. And for
Absolutely.
free? Yeah. Well, yes, please. We'll sign the contract right now. So that effort to actually go out of your way and do a little bit of something to get the work just pays off enormously.
You kidding? One of the reasons, there's a company called Rise, and I had not worked with them, but I had wanted to work with them. And the reason they started working with me in Westworld was I asked them to bid on a sequence of this, helicopter drone thing coming in season 3 on Westworld. And, I'm like, just send us a bid over the weekend. Over the weekend, they sent me the bid, and they sent me, just a temp that looked like something we almost aired. It was so good. It was those little things that I'm like, oh, yes, I can trust you with all these things.
So one last thing I wanted to go over before we sort of close the presentation and do Q&A. I wanted to go over a little bit about the logistics and how we manage a project like this. All of you folks from the Visual Effects Society know all of this. If you've been in the business for 5 years to get your membership, you've encountered this. But I know some of the students haven't from when I was an instructor here. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of things. First of all, casting the vendors, how we chose who did what. That's a very difficult negotiation. Originally, we started out with the idea that we would have 4 companies on the show, and we knew who they were, and we were bidding them, and everything was great along the way. Each of them was going to have many millions of dollars worth of work. They were going to be very happy. And then as things got busy in the industry, we had 3 of those companies come to us and say, oh, they couldn't do the work anymore. They couldn't fit us in. So we were like scrambling to find other companies. And it becomes really tricky because some companies come to you and it's just a numbers game. Like they just like, give us some number, we'll sign a contract, we'll figure out what to do later. And that's not really how we work.
No.
Like we want to specifically assign work to people. So we looked at the companies that we had relationships. Jay has companies that he'd like to work with that he identified, like, I think this company would be good for this and this and that. And we would approach them. Some could do it, some couldn't do it. Others, it was just like calling the phone like, hey, can you fit in $200,000 worth of work? I got one scene based on what I've seen from your stuff on the internet I think would be perfect for you. Can you squeeze it in? And it was just a really tricky balance. And some people would say, I can do this scene for you. We'd be perfect for it. But I can't really put a team on it unless we've got some other work. Because I need a certain amount of work to make it fit. Like to put a supervisor on your show and put their time in. So then we would go through and say, okay, what are you good at? Crafty Apes, the people who did Connor, specifically said to us, we want that character. They looked at the whole at our bid sheet. They looked at everything and said, this is us. Just give us him.
And this is the team we have available right now.
Yeah, and this is the team.
Great.
We have 3D people. They're busy. We have other people. They're busy. I could put a team on this right now. We could crank through it. And we said, like, perfect. And they nailed it. Like almost every shot that they gave to us was done on version 1. And they were very passionate about just give us this section. And it was several $1 million worth of work at the end. It definitely paid off for them to just focus on that one thing and do a great job with it. And ultimately, most of these companies, as we were working with them, then got more resources and said, hey, we could take more things on, and we would assign them. But it's actually a huge puzzle to figure out this. And I had a bulletin board on my wall with all of our different vendors and 3x5 cards.
Exactly.
And we would just like, this company gets this, and we would slide them around as bids came in.
And then there were a couple companies that were like okay, thank goodness they're going to be taking all the hard stuff. Like, and that was the interesting thing. The company Refuge up in Oregon, that was literally a friend of mine called and said, these are my new favorite company. And so I just called him that day. I'm like, hey, I have a friend who says they're your favorite company. I'm going to give you a bunch of stuff because you do weird, hard things all the time. And he was like, okay. And he's the one who did the Coids, and they did those relationships and those recommendations go further than anything else. The second you get a call from someone and they say, I love a company, oh my goodness, can't call them quick enough.
Yeah, and also pay attention when somebody tells you they don't love a company, because you will save yourself a lot of hardships in the past. Yeah. There were a couple of landmines that we dodged from recommendations from people who were just like, hey, just want you to know, just did some
this
work
is where
with
they're
them.
at.
And
they might have been good
like,
before.
That 3x5 card is moving now, you know. Speaking of 3x5 cards, let me show you this. One of the problems with our show for us, I mean, it was great for the show, but because it was sort of a time travel aspect, it didn't really necessarily have to flow exactly as it was scripted. That scenes could move around, and quickly in editorial, they decided that they were going to, like, this scene from episode 5 could move into episode 8, and this scene from episode 8 could move into 3. And
it's also the shows. It's the same things with Westworld.
With Westworld, yeah.
It's like that's just the way the brains work on these shows.
So really, during most of editorial, up until maybe the last 2 months, well after we had turned over shots to all of our vendors, those things kept changing around. And we had a PA in post whose job it was every day to take the continuity from the editors and just move all those 3x5 cards around. And then our team would have to look at the cards and go, oh, we've got to tell Crafty Apes that we need this scene 2 weeks earlier, but this scene can come 3 weeks later. And every day it was that phone call or emails where we were saying, here's the latest update. This scene goes here, this scene goes there, blah, blah, blah. And all of our vendors had to navigate that, which has probably made us the most annoying company to work with, or most annoying production, but it actually went smoothly. We handled it really well. And let me show you how we did that. First of all, we had a great team. This was our wrap party. This was on our last day on the show.
Tacos for all.
You can see it was Jay and I, plus we had a visual effects production manager who handled all of our invoices and bids and keeping track of all of that, purchase orders and so on. She also managed our 2 coordinators. Our 2 coordinators were basically in charge of tracking all of our elements, making sure that things were moving along correctly. They ran our daily sessions, and they made sure that the notes from us, from Jay and I, as we were reviewing shots, would get out to our vendors. We had our VFX editor, who first off, when we were still shooting and our editors were doing assembly edits, he would do temps for them. I would work with him to sit down and go like, okay, well, this is kind of how this effect is supposed to look. This is how it's conceived. And he would give them temp effects to put in and slug in for timing. He then, once we were sort of locked and doing turnovers, he had 2 assistant editors. The assistant editors mostly focused on turnovers. We would look at what, as different scenes would lock, our editors would say, these scenes are ready to turn over. Jay and I would review them. We'd come up with some notes. And then our VFX editor would turn it over to his assistants, who would then put the footage out to the vendors, chop it all up, get the footage pulled for them. They would get all of the information along with the coordinators, like lens grids, camera info, all of that would go out. And then our VFX editor mostly focused on the work that we were getting back. He would QC it to make sure that the frame lengths were correct, that they lined it up, everything worked out the way it was supposed to. He would give it a preliminary look-see to just like find any problems like duplicate frames, or if there was things in frame that weren't supposed to be there, you know, if there was tape on the floor or whatever, he would look for that. And then we had one in-house After Effects artist, because our post-producer penciled it out and found that just doing like basic split screens and repos and stuff, doing them at the online house, which was normally how we would do this in the old days, was going to be much more expensive than just having one guy in-house who did that. So he didn't actually do very much in terms of real traditional visual effects. He was really doing sort of online effects, split screens, repos. Occasionally he would paint out things, but it was mostly retimes, that sort of stuff.
Because also our post house wasn't quite, that's not where they shine. So it ended up being a lot of stuff that, and some post houses I think they would have been fine, but it just wasn't where we were at.
Yeah, they were kind of at capacity with what they could do for that. So then, in addition to that, of course, there's the other very important people in post, the actual editors, the post producer, post supervisor, all of those people who manage things. But our in-house team, this is what it was. In terms of tracking it, we have software. There's a variety of databases that different people use. This is one of the industry standards. This is called ShotGrid. It allows us to track every version of every shot and every element, the notes that were given on it when it came in, whether we approved it, whether we kicked it back for some reason. We could track the status of every single shot along the way. We could look at it and figure out where we were going. When we got a version back, it allowed me to go through and look at it and go like, okay, these are the previous notes we've given. Have we hit those notes? Okay, good, we've hit those notes. Let's put this in dailies for Jay to look at. Basically, it just allows us to sort of keep track of all those enormous amounts of assets, because you literally are juggling tens of thousands on a big enough show. You'd be dealing with hundreds of thousands of different individual video elements. This was our dailies review log that we did every day. On this particular day, we had 94 shots that we would go through. We would view them one at a time. Jay and I would give notes. Generally speaking, the way it would work was we always had different things that we were focusing on. Jay was like very much into what would his executive producers do. I was more like a QC pass. I would look at, grain issues and all of that sort of stuff. I also like to keep dailies reviews open because everybody, has their own little thing. So if anybody on the team saw something, they were free to call out, because you'll always have that one guy who's like a stickler for horizon lines or black levels, or just the guy who's like, we're so focused on, does the Coid look good? Is the animation good? Is the render good? And somebody would go, hey, like there's a Coke bottle in the background. You're like, oh, I totally missed that. So it's good to have like your whole team look at the shots. We would then put the notes in. We would come to an agreement, like these are the set of notes. We all agree on this. This is going to go to the vendor. And then the vendor would get an email like this. I've particularly selected one that says all the shots are approved, because I don't want to call anybody out for like a mistake that they made on a show. But they would get a list like this, an email just lists every shot, its status, what the notes were, what we wanted to fix along the way. And then there's separate databases to keep track of all the production stuff. In our case, Jay likes to use a database on Airtable. This is a database that Amazon likes to use called vSlate. There's other variations. Different producers have different things they like to work with. But this allowed us to keep track of our finances. And you see that I've blurred numbers out because that's nobody's business. But we could get bids in, we could compare, we could look at what different vendors, we're going to charge for things, but we could also just look at individual sequences. How much is this sequence going to cost? How much is this episode going to cost? How much are we giving to this vendor versus this other vendor? We could do reports like this where we would say, this is the breakdown, this is what's going to vendors, are we on track? Are we giving this particular company the amount of work that we promised? Are we overloading them? We could also look at tax incentives, so that for each vendor we could look at, okay, this one's in Montreal, we get a 40% tax rebate, so it would automatically calculate that. A company in England, we would get the 25% rebate for. India, no rebate. Portland, no rebate. So, could factor that out. And we could look at our bottom line is like, we had a target. When we went into production, the assumption was we were going to be doing all of the work in London, and we would be getting a 25% rebate from it all. So there was a target number of where they wanted to be with that rebate. Given that we scattered the work over a bunch of different places and different territories with different tax rebates, we still had to look at that and go like, are we on track for that? Like, we're not doing as much work in London with the 25% rebate, but we're doing some work with a 40% rebate. That kind of balances out. We're doing some work in India, which is cheaper than we would have paid with the rebate anyway in London. So you look at all those numbers. It also, on the other side of the page, gives you sort of a status of where all your shots are. Are they done? Are they approved? Are there still things in progress with each vendor? And then also it allowed us to keep our camera data. I can't stress enough for those of you who are students, when you are on set, there is so much information that you need, that your artists at all your vendors are going to need. Every little bit of camera data, not just what the lens setting was, but which lens was used, because you're going to need to have lens grids that you're going to shoot for each lens to make sure that you can see the exact distortion of that lens. You're going to need to take LiDAR of sets. You're going to need to take photogrammetry of sets. You're going to need to take set measurements. Maybe you'll get blueprints from the art department. You might do witness camera footage. All of that gets tracked so that when you send a shot to a vendor and they say, what was the lens on that shot? You can just quickly go into your database and go, what was the shot number? Oh, it was a 50 millimeter lens on take 2. That's what you need to know. So you will have a lot of paperwork like that you have to keep track of. It's a monumental task, but if you don't do that,
it's way worse.
Yeah, it's way worse. You will not hit your deadlines. Your artists won't be able to do the really top quality work that you want to do. So just be thinking about these things when you go into production, how you're going to hold on to all that information. And then let me show you just a few more shots that we did that were not in this presentation, but that we're kind of particularly happy with.
Peripheral hands.
Nano cloaking technology. Death by bees.
It's a rough way to go.
Can't tell necessarily in these quick things, but the sides of that vehicle are CG because it didn't get damaged enough in the real stunt.
This end sequence ended up being an entire CG train that we had to figure out at the end of the day. There was a real train going through there, but it looked like Thomas the Tank Engine. It was going so slow. So we ended up just doing a full CG one, which was a lot of fun.
And then as we wrap up here and before we do Q&A, I just want to stress that Jay and I are really, advisors. We tell the artists at the visual effects companies what we'd like them to see. We can coach them on, ideas and make suggestions. But ultimately, the work that's done is by individual artists like you guys, like the Gnomon students who are going to be coming out of here. And so we really can't thank the artists enough who did the work on this, because, we could say like, it'd be really great if this swarm of bees was like on the glass and then the doors open and then they rush in. But there's a whole team of artists behind that, not just one guy, but probably, 5 or 6 or 7 people who made that happen, who did the day in, day out work for weeks to make the shots like that happen. So we want to just say thank you to all of our vendors and to everybody who worked on the show. We really appreciate it. It's fantastic. And then thanks again to Gnomon for letting us come here tonight and tell you about our show.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. We have time now for some Q&A. Chris in the back has a lovely soft mic that he can hand out.
Those things crack me up.
Wow, this is fun. Hello, I really like the game VR sequence. I just want to ask about the use of AI technology. I'm assuming it's something you'd want to try and play with in the future in different shows. What are some of the drawbacks or limitations you can imagine running into? Or maybe if it's even too early to think about that because it's not been experimented with enough?
I don't know. I'm already breaking things left and right with AI. I've got some stuff I can't talk about, but it's like I'm always calling my different technology companies. I'm like, okay, I got an idea, and they're like, what did you think of this time? But I think that's where, as an artist, there's just a lot of flexibility out there for it. I think there's a whole conversation about what's going to replace artists and this, that, and the other thing. And I don't think we're there right now. I'm at the point where, like, the Coid head, right? That was one where it took us like 2-3 weeks to try and figure out how we were going to make this triangle head out of this thing. And so right when DALL-E came out, I decided to type in what Jonah had said to me, almost word for word, just into this thing to see what it was going to come up with. Now, granted, it didn't come up with what we came up with, but it, as a non-artist, it would have helped me to be able to figure out much more quickly, to be able to help my visual effects artist say, look, something like this, because I did all these weird searches for, you know, robot heads with cracks and triangles, and of course nothing comes up. So I think there's this interesting balance that we're going to be getting to with how artists can. Now, I will say the other side, I've already seen it go the opposite direction, where I had a director who went to an artist and said, I'm really trusting you as an artist. And they came up with a bunch of AI generated images, and she fired him instantly. And she was like, what are you doing? I can do that. Like, no, I'm coming to you. You're the artist. You need to do this in a way that's more creative than I'm going to come up with. So I think it's this interesting balance of there's this new tool, but I think there's already going to be some people who are like, look, I still trust the human more than the computer, which I think is a really beneficial thing. But just going back to your question, I don't think we've even scratched the surface yet in terms of the ways we can utilize technology and infiltrate it into the pipeline of what we're doing, and how artists can take almost control of what's going on there and use it to the advantage of the show in a storytelling way. That's, I think, the exciting part for me of just like I said, we gave him a bunch of images from a video game and he overlaid it and made our whole show look like that. It was a really fascinating thing of all of a sudden it opens up my brain of going, oh, okay, that's a different way of thinking about using the technology.
Also, just to throw out there, when it works great. One way we know that it works really great is in aging and de-aging. That's proven tech. There's a number of people who've shown this. There's a VES event coming up, I think, next weekend about that. Look at your emails for those of you who are VS members. But also in some places, when it doesn't work, it doesn't work. A friend of mine gave me an assignment recently. It's like, I want a picture that looks like this, and gave me like a couple, you know, like hugging and looking like they're on a date. I need this couple, but I need them to look like they're at a wedding. So she's got to be a wedding dress and he's got to be in a tux, and they need to look shocked. And so, you know, I went through 3 different AI tools out there, and I spent a full day doing all kinds of prompts and experimenting, and got nothing but nightmare fuel.
Exactly.
Like none of it was usable. It was all scary and creepy. So, you know, you just gotta, you can't put all your eggs in that basket for sure yet.
Yeah.
Hi guys. So you mentioned 2 challenges, one overtly and one kind of subtly, which is the bandwidth problem.
Can you put your
the bandwidth problem that the entire industry went through past 18 months, and what sounds like an ever-evolving ask from the creatives. And how often did you have to go back to the showrunners and say, no, we can't do that. No one's able to get that done in time?
Not that often, actually. Like, we had a few things here and there, but because the schedule kept expanding, we were able to say yes to a lot more than I think we had initially thought of.
Right, and also, we don't really like to say no necessarily. It's maybe more of a, how about this? You want to see it 20 times. What if we see it 7 times?
Yeah.
Or
it's that compromise.
We can't exactly do that, but this other thing would be close like it. So there's a little bit of give and take. But it was tended to be more of like, we can definitely do that. We just can't do it a lot.
Yeah. And it was really then, like we said, I think the bigger challenge we had at a few times was they came up with an idea. We even had the money in the schedule to do it. And then it was finding the right team to do it, because we've both been in the experience too many times where it's, we say yes to something, we give it to one vendor, and it's like, ooh, that wasn't their specialty, or just they didn't have the right team for it. So I think that was more so. And I think we even had a couple of some vendors that I won't name that I was a little hesitant, and thankfully they totally killed it. But it was like, I don't know. And then, you know, it wasn't even that we were desperate. It's that they had done certain things, but they hadn't done the type of thing we were asking them to do. And they totally stepped up to the plate and knocked it out of the park. So we didn't have any of those, you know, kind of difficult ones, thankfully. But it was always that kind of give and take of which companies are going to highlight which things and which ones are going to be able to benefit from those. So it was that constant process back and forth.
Okay, thanks. What was the name of the company of the guy who did the Game of Thrones break?
Control Media.
Perfect.
In
Thank you.
Belgium. Be sure to look for in Belgium because there's another company called Control Medium that's not there.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's like electronic controls or something like that.
And I think you have to. It's actually hard to find the trailer. I'll find the name for it in a minute, and I'll come up and I'll show it to you.
Nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
I actually had a question for y'all. I was curious. It seems like everything that you worked on, you were all very excited about throughout the whole show. But I know that sometimes the students or just any kind of creative, they have to trudge through something that they're not super excited about. When you guys are faced with something like that, how do you get to the other side of it?
Well, you know, I come from a background of working at a post house for many, many years, and you get a mix of shows. So like at one company, I was doing Heroes, so like the top superhero show on TV at the time. And the next show that would come in would be just like driving comps and stuff, right? And there's a certain amount of beauty fixes, painting out pimples. And honestly, there's a whole lot of just explaining to people like you don't actually get to work on the coolest, hottest thing all the time. But you know what? Those pimple painting out and those wire removals and those car comps pay your mortgage and is going to put your kid through college. And so it's really worthwhile to do some of those for a while and just bank that money. And then you're going to get on a cool thing again later, because the cool thing about this business is it's cyclical. You'll get a great job. You'll get one that pays the bills that you're not as excited about, but you know what? You still put the care and time in it. You still make it look as good as you possibly can every single time if you're a professional, right? But you may not be like thrilled to come home and tell your wife, oh my God, did the best car comp today, right? But it's, you know, I'm paying my kids' way through Berkeley right now because of those less exciting shots. So, you know, there you go.
Exactly. I think that's the other one is I don't know, for a show like this, there wasn't pretty much anything that wasn't super fun. I mean, there was some things that we had to fight with a little bit more because it's just like, oh man, why is that thing so hard? But that's kind of normal for it. You know what I mean? I think that was from a creative standpoint, we got, you know, the benefit of this one was it was a pretty rich canvas to begin with. But yeah, I'm with, you know, with Mark there. Half the time you're just like, all right, I guess it's a monitor comp show.
Yeah,
cool.
You know,
just crank them out.
On the show, we did have our fair share of monitor comps,
did.
and we did have removing tape marks on the floor. You know, all of that. You do it in every show. No matter how cool the show is, there's also just painting out, you know, something somebody left on set for some reason. You're going to have that all the time.
All the time.
Hi. What advice would you have for like someone coming out of school going into the industry? I know it's a pretty open-ended question, but yeah.
Wow.
I'll tell you my
Oh, I have one. You go first.
I think that it's critical for an artist, no matter how much time you spend learning to draw and learning how to use the tools, whether you're a 3D artist or a compositor or whatever, you need to study photography. Because everything that we do is to mix our media with real practical photography. So you need to know everything about lenses and f-stops and all of focal distance and everything to make sure that your stuff looks exactly like the way a camera would reproduce it, but also about the way a cameraman would move a camera. Because if you're doing 3D, you know, visualizations, or you're just doing a move in a 3D environment, like Jay said, a lot of times you're going to want a director who doesn't want something that you couldn't do for real. So sometimes you will. You'll get the guy who wants the camera to go through a wall and up a vent and do all of these crazy things and fly around the car like a way you could never. But most of the time, your job is to make something look like real practical photography. So study it intensely.
Yeah, and I'll also say there's like the balance between lighting for real versus lighting the way a DP would light it. And sometimes it goes both ways. Sometimes it's like the artist overlights it like it's in a studio, which is never how a DP would light it. And it, you know, and then sometimes it's like, guys, the DP would never put that light there. You got to light it like the DP would light it, not like, you know, you're showing off your work. The other one is always just throw it away. don't highlight your work in your work and make it look more. It makes it look more real. I think the other one for me, since I come more just from the show side, I would say get really good at something. Like just get really, really good at something. Whether it even be being a generalist, whether it be a matte painter, whether it be something, get really good at something. And that's where, when I call a company, I basically say, what are you really good at right now? And sure enough, like I remember sending a bid package to a company on magicians once and it was like, it was a nothing package, and it was like to do this behind the scenes thing. And they saw that there was a part that they weren't getting to bid on that had this, smoke simulation. And they're like, no, we have to have that. I got, this woman who's the best smoke person you've ever seen in your life. You got to get this to us. I'm like, oh, I've never even seen that on your reel. Sure. And it was home run from the beginning. So I think my one is, get really, really good at something.
What about the ever-evolving technology of moving cameras, drones and movies, and that stuff that's changing the way you're cinema? How's that affecting what you're doing in previews?
See, for me, Jonah always still uses real cameras on everything. Like on Westworld, he flew a drone inside a volume because he wanted to see what it would do. Like literally, he didn't even put it on a crane. He put it a drone. They're like, you're putting a drone inside the volume? Isn't that? He's like, yeah, of course. So it's like, it's still a real camera. Do you know what I'm saying? And that's the other one, is making it always feel like a real camera, even like going more into like the way, Favreau did Lion King, and building everything around real camera moves, not visual effects CG camera moves, and having that grounded in that more based in reality thing, that every single one of those moves was done by a real camera operator, is why why Lion King ended up feeling more real than some other animated things in the past, or at least more in the style of what John was going for. So it's like, I think it's like Mark was saying, studying the reality of how the cameras actually work more, Stephen, and understanding how the technology really works. Like, yeah, understand how the drones really fly, understand really how cranes work, understand heights and distances, and the fact that, like, speed. I can't tell you how many times I've seen when someone's trying to do a camera move, I'm like, guys, the camera you could never move a camera that fast. Like, it's impossible. Make the camera move like it would really move, and you're going to end up with a better shot.
But also, to get back to your question, like with evolving camera technology, the main thing is you got to make it look like your show looks like your show. So if you have a show where they're in a pattern where they do their wides, they do mediums, tights, move the camera, wides, mediums, tights, and you suddenly are doing some weird like roundy round thing on a shot that doesn't match anything else in the show, it's going to really bump. But there are other shows where the guys, like, everything's on a techno crane and it's all moving around, and you can get away with that. So it's really stylistically in every aspect, whether it's camera movement or the look or color, it has to match the look of that specific show, that DP's aesthetics, that director's aesthetics, and the production designer's aesthetic. Your job as a visual effects supervisor or artist is to match the aesthetics of those three people.
Exactly.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a few questions regards the elevator shot that you guys shot on the volume. So what camera you guys, the DP use, the lenses, and the ND filters that you use, and how, when you render from Maya, the scene, right, the elevator shot, how do you guys control in the volume, the depth of field when you were shooting?
Yeah, that's the biggest problem with it, is it wasn't ever we just rendered it as a QuickTime. We didn't build that in Unreal, so there wasn't any real-time rendering for any of that stuff that we did, which, thankfully, I'm like, we're in an elevator. We can't exactly move the camera a lot, and the sequence is so big, we're not really worried about the parallax, but that's the biggest challenge with those, is the depth of field. So it's like, that was one of the other things we kept fighting with, was you're only so wide, so your depth of field isn't quite far enough. Do you know what I mean? And that's where we're like, can you just please go on a longer lens and throw this out of focus a little bit more? It's going to help everybody out a lot, just because it created more of that realism for those reflections and for the other things. But there was, it was basically just whatever lens the DP wanted to throw on it. for what it would fit inside. Once again, what it would do to really fit inside a real elevator. And now we're going to do that. But that's where the previs ended up helping, because we were able to help figure that out a little bit.
Thank you.
But I'm always like, just please don't put a filter on that. It's going to mess up our LED wall.
Hi. I was just wondering, how often did you guys refer back to the original source material for any inspiration visually? I know it was based off of a book by William Gibson, so I was just curious, do you refer back to the original source material for visual inspiration, or?
This is an interesting one where sometimes you have a little bit more and sometimes you have a little bit less. This was the story was enough and the world was enough. So, we had a lot of throwbacks, but it was more themes and characters, not specifics, if I can say that. The writer, Scott Smith, who wrote every episode, as well as Vincenzo, who was an executive producer and directed the first few and was involved in for, a year in prep, doing all the development. They were the ones who were really the caretakers of his vision. So they were bringing those things in all the time. But it wasn't really like, we're not trying to make a documentary of the book for this particular one, if that makes sense. So we referred to it, but we weren't kind of bound by it. So we had a lot more freedom creatively to come up with our own ideas. And if it was something that was outside of that, they would definitely come to us and be like, it's not really where Gibson was at with that one. But we had a lot more freedom, I think. If you look at the costumes, the costumes in the show are bonkers. And I think there was a lot of freedom for all the departments to come up with all those unique ideas.
But also, I think at some point in post, Vincenzo went and showed a cut to Gibson to get his buy-off and make sure that he was comfortable with it.
Yeah, he did. They definitely showed it to him throughout to make sure that it was, and thankfully he loved it. And I guess there had been some misfires with some of his work in the past, so it was a nice stamp of approval for us.
All right, any further questions?
Thanks for coming out, everybody.
Yeah, really appreciate it.
Thank you to Mark. Thank you to Jay. Awesome presentation. Thanks for coming out, and good night from the Gnomon stage here in Hollywood, and good night to everybody on streaming. Thank you.